Okay, all right, that's good. Good evening, everyone. We'll get started since it's just about 7:30. Welcome to Greenlight Bookstore. We are very excited to host tonight's event with literary cool girl Stephanie LaCava, presenting her new book, I Fear My Pain Interests You. She will be talking with Merve Emre, so you're in for an excellent time. Before I turn things over to them, just a few housekeeping rules. Please turn off or silence your cell phones if you haven't already. Please keep your masks on for the entirety of the event and your time in the store this evening. We really appreciate it. And lastly, and very importantly, we have signed books for sale at the register. Stephanie kindly signed our entire stock of the novel. It's very slim and portable. It looks great, so buy one or several. Our interviewer for this evening is Merve Emre, a professor of English and contributing writer at The New Yorker. She is currently a distinguished writer-in-residence at Wesleyan University. And Emre will be speaking with our featured author, Stephanie LaCava. LaCava is a writer based in New York City. Her work has appeared in Harper's, Artforum, Text sur Kunst, the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, Vogue, and Interview. Her debut novel, The Superrationals, was published by Semiotext in 2020. And her new book, I Fear My Pain Interests You, is an absurdist novel about fame, culture, and connections, bodies and breakdowns, and was praised by Jordan Richman as the Cool Girl Book of the Year. So you're in for something very special tonight. Stephanie will be reading from the book, and then Merve will join her in conversation, and then you'll all have the chance to ask some questions after that, so please join me in welcoming to the stage. They're already here, Stephanie LaCava and Merve Emre.
Actually, Steph, before you read, could we just meditate on that introduction?
Yeah, I'd like that.
So first, I will point out that when Greenlight advertised the event, I was also a literary cool girl, but now I am no longer one.
Definitely.
But no, I'm not. But I am. You know that is that language has orbited this novel in really interesting and I think troubling ways, and I'm curious just to hear you reflect on that a little bit before we delve into the reading, because maybe that's a nice way to orient people who have not yet read the novel to some of its characters and concerns.
And you saw my face, yeah. I mean, it has been actually a troubling thing for me. There were a couple times when I was asked to be a part of profiles, and they're like, this is what we want the headline to be, and I was like, no way, like, that's not, that has nothing to do with my practice, it has nothing to do with, but it actually is interesting in the sense of how it doubles over into the themes of the book, and themes of most of my work, which is how, I guess you could say jeune fille, or you could say, young woman, is seen in the world and used in the world in terms of, so in a way, it's almost like playing a trick on itself, or it's like I played the trick on the book, or you know what I mean, or vice versa. That the ultimate thing has happened to make it more conceptual in that it's become that which it mocks, or that which it wishes to talk about or discuss.
Right. I mean, it's an interesting kind of misreading, though, and it's a misreading that speaks to a desire for coolness and for coolness to be affiliated with or aligned with femininity in a particular way, and for it to be visible too, something that people can consume, something they can feast their eyes on. Why do you think that is? Where does that desire for the cool girl come from?
I think it's very problematic also because of the idea of it being, this goes the same for the sad girl thing that I have to keep talking about, is that it is a woman, by the way, and we should probably be saying woman. I keep being, no, not to you, but people keep telling me that, and I think it was a valid point about that. Why do we always say sad? We wouldn't say like sad boy, literary sad boys. Do you know what I mean? Or like.
Oh well, I think we would talk about literary. We would talk about sad boy, B-O-I-S. We would talk about
exactly. Oh my God, B-O-I-S, totally. That's so good. But yeah, I think it is problematic also because it's just this intense desire to cast it into a category, to have it be categorized as something, and also to, back to the idea of the author and the death of the author, if we want to go there, or the idea of persona, and everyone today is performing being an author, and signing up to do this is literally, in some ways, and we see it throughout New York City now, and more alternative ways as well, is there are people who are performing being authors without actually,
writing anything.
I don't know, interpretive dance, I don't know, but there are all these ways in which, the culture industry And that's always been something I'm interested in, which is why it's kind of cool that I'm trying to look at the positive of what's happened with that, and rather than the negative, in that it's become kind of, evidence of itself. It's like eating its own tail, that it started to become that.
So the sad girl, or the cool girl, or the jeune fille, whatever, at the heart of your novel, Margot,
Yes.
is the character, is the narrator, the protagonist, and it is her voice that we will be listening to in this excerpt that you will read for us now. And maybe you could just orient the audience, who is Margot, where does she come from, who are her parents, what does she, what congenital disorder does she suffer from, just some of those details.
Okay, perfect. Well, Margot is this young woman who we're going to see now around the age of 11 or 13. We first see her in the book on an airplane, in the bathroom, which, high in the sky on her way to Montana. And then throughout the book, we see her in lots of different iterations, but in most of them, she is this she's our narrator, and she is also very affected while appearing aloof by her family. Her mother and father were famous punk musicians who then became, or actually they were punk musicians who then became famous, which is kind of an important distinction in some of the themes of the book, because that changed the stakes of the relationship, and also it becomes an important talking point between the mother and the father and what transaction was really going on in terms of their dynamic. And, and Margot's also been, while she's lived a life of great privilege and continues to, she was very much neglected as a child, and that the way that shows itself most glaringly, almost comically, is that she had a disorder in which she didn't feel physical pain that she didn't know about until someone told her when she was 23. I mean, it's like your child, it's like not knowing your child has blonde hair, let's say, until they're like, her parents were off doing so many other things, and I think that's the most glaring example of where that sort of peaks out.
Okay, so do you want to go ahead and read
Yes.
one of the scenes in which we see her inability to feel physical pain manifest itself?
I walked to the break in the fence and placed one palm on each end of the cut wire. At first I felt nothing, and then came a shiver, like when I would play with my mother's friend's daughter's hair. She and her friends were always playing strange games that let you touch one another in acceptable ways to create sensations that were not. That chill, then nothing. And then another shiver, this time in my legs. My feet were always numb, even on the hot sand in summer beyond the touch of the tide, or when my father, almost drunk, on one of his nights would make me run barefoot in the city snow. I felt nothing then. He would lift his feet like sewing machine pins, and they would turn bright pink. I felt nothing. Told no one. I thought if I touched the wires, I would know for certain, but they didn't have much effect. Like when I had put the guitar picks in the electrical socket. Nothing had happened then either. My mother had freaked out when she heard about it, and I had started crying, and that seemed to make her think that I needed her attention, and I had logged that. And from then on, I kept pretending, taking cues from reactions. I mimicked the onlooker's level of intensity. I didn't feel anything when a knife slipped and took a sliver of my finger. My bagel shop boss threw up. I never understood. I don't know why I said throw up like that, but I never understood why other children hated going to the doctor so much, why they cried at shots or the finger prick. I could kick my knee when the doctor hit it with the orange gummy triangle. Sometimes I forgot to, but then he would try it again and I would do it right. I experimented on myself all the time. I took the two ends of the wire, threaded them together, and felt something very faint. It began in that hard callus on my left foot and ran to each toe. I braided the two wires more tightly and licked them, closed my eyes and let my mouth fall open and my jaw widen. And for a moment, I was outside my body looking at myself, like that nun statue in the books at the back of the house. Thérèse, in a headcloth, a deep hole below stone lips, like an acting exercise, imagining the sculpture as an extension of myself. I put the wet cables to my chest. As I'd seen one of the coaches do to the dead kid who had been hit at the lacrosse game. My t-shirt was too thick. At least that seemed like a good enough reason. No sensation, but the feeling that something wasn't right. The defibrillator machine hadn't reset his heart. How often does violence restart life? It was the saddest thing I'd ever seen up until that point. My mother shouted at me afterward, "This is why a middle schooler does not go to a high school sporting event." The chances of hitting someone between heartbeats with the ball traveling at 100 miles per hour is almost nil. What a stupid thing for her to say. A diamond-eyed cow made an uncharacteristic bleating noise, and I dropped the wires, turned, and ran home.
I love so much about that. Yes, let's actually. There's so much there that I want to pull on, but maybe I'll just start with the fact that you have a child who cannot feel physical pain, miming the action of jump-starting her own heart, which I think is extraordinary. So there's a great deal of the cool girl discourse, let's call it, that we were talking about, that turns on the idea that women feel things, but in order to make themselves attractive, they repress or suppress those feelings. But here you have a character who literally cannot feel pain. What is the difference between that? What is the difference between repressing your pain or suppressing your pain, performing a lack of pain, and actually not being able to feel physical pain?
I think that's a great question, and it just brings me back to, I have a friend whose specialty is psychoanalysis of AI, and the first thing she said about the book was, what's crazy about this book is it's an inversion of hysteria, which I guess is kind of what you're saying too, to some degree, right?
Yes.
Which I think is so accurate and not something I was necessarily cognizant of when I was doing it, but really resonates with me now because of this idea of it being, the opposite of being out of control, and the idea of creating control. And of course, it's different to suppress one's emotions in a performative way, which is, it's not lost on anyone that she's an actress, but she actually doesn't have to suppress them because she literally doesn't feel them, which is what the disorder, creates.
I mean, the fact that she's an actress, or that she wants to become an actress,
exactly,
was also extremely interesting to me, because so much of her childhood, as you framed it, as the book frames it, is about not being seen by your parents, right? And not being seen by anyone, to the point where you can undergo great traumatic physical pain and nobody notices that you're not reacting to it because they can't see you. And she chooses a profession that will give her the most visibility, in a sense. So what are, the novel seems to be interested in the right and the wrong ways, or the different ways that people can see us, or in the ways that they fail to see us. So could you just talk a little bit about what it means to be seen in this novel?
For sure. The first place where my mind goes with that is that then she, and redirect me if I'm going the wrong way, is that she then chooses these men who don't see her either. They only see they see these transactional things about her, and they see her as like a vehicle for experimentation, or they're not actually seeing her or caring about her, or even, there's a moment she feels a bit like ashamed of having to explain what had happened in her family, or of really, having any kind of real true connection, that idea of being seen through connection. But in terms of the idea of being seen as an actress, it's true that it's very odd that she would choose this profession, because she kind of oscillates between hating the idea of being famous, of saying, she even says at one point, I wanted to be an actress in spite of fame, and taking this stance that she wanted to do it so that she could kind of prove something to someone, or because she had been given fame when she was born, so she was going to kind of take it back by then making it her own, or however. There's a lot of taking back of things in this story, or of a young woman trying to take back things that have happened to her, or that feel like they aren't so easy to change, or that they're inherited, and what does it mean to have something be inherited, and whether it's genetic or otherwise.
Well, one of the things that seems inherited is a kind of logic of celebrity in this book, which is that the more publicly visible you are, the more people see you, but the more you are available for their projection. So all they really see is what they want to see, right? And so that seems to be part of the problem that the novel is offering up to us too, that you can sort of scream for visibility, and that won't mean that anyone will necessarily see the reality of what it is to be you.
And I think that is also the question of, do we ever know really who Margot is?
Right. Right, no, that I think gets to something else I wanted to talk to you about, which is the tone or the style of the novel, which is, I think, extremely funny, first of all. I mean, when you read it or when you perform it, you hear the humor in it, but a lot of that humor is won from a kind of hardness, a withholding, a refusal to indulge pain, right? The fear that someone's pain might interest another person, and so you're not going to indulge that interest. Can you talk about how you crafted, or how you thought about crafting that tone or that style?
For me, it was also like I really wanted to be sure that there was a kind of distance between the reader and Margot, not like not in the sense that you're not in her psychic space, because the entire book is her psychic space,
Right.
but in the sense that you can create distance while allowing someone into, I mean, we do it all the time, right? While allowing someone into our psychic space, depending on how we act or how we deliver words or how we, and in a way, this is kind of a much simpler answer probably than what you're looking for, but in a way for me, it was an exercise because in real life, I'm extremely emotional and I'm extremely forthcoming and I'm extremely open and like, I mean, some people would just like, everything's there and it's all out there and there's no, and this is the exact opposite of that.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me was really important because I wanted to try that as both exercise and also for me, whenever I'm writing, it becomes kind of a musical thing as well. Like I listen to the cadence of it, and then I decide whether it feels right or wrong. It very much in an intuitive sense rather than any kind of like proper, mapping out of a sentence or. There's also a kind of a French, if we get into like the punctuation isn't, probably wouldn't be allowed by some publishers in the way it's presented in the book because it's very French almost in its, I guess what you say, and it's like lack of punctuation or fragments or.
Yeah, it's quite clipped.
Yeah.
But radical publishers were so over here. Radical in terms of punctuation, radical in terms of politics. They do it all. I mean, but what you're saying, it's the clipped tone, the hard tone, the cool tone, the tone that's always sort of shrugging off death or the possibility of harm or violence as a kind of joke, right? That goes hand in hand with these reservoirs of deep feeling, and deep feeling that perhaps Margot can't access herself, but that we get a sense of precisely by its absence, right? By the lack of it. We feel the lack, don't we?
A lot of people have said that the book is very discomforting, and would you agree with that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so I was thinking about the beginning that you described to people where you open in the bathroom of the plane. And there are these two phrases from that really jump out at me where I felt my skin crawl when I was reading it. And the first is when she is scraping something off of the faucet and she describes the sort of gunk on the faucet as a soft-bodied soap thing. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. Like, that's amazingly estranging. And it's the way she thinks about her own body, too, right? As a kind of soft-bodied thing that she can't ever completely inhabit.
Totally.
And then the other moment is, you're going to have to cite it for me because I can't quite remember it, but when she's thinking about the part of her chin that's been cut.
Right.
The poor piece of flesh.
Right, yes.
Yeah. She says something like, poor piece of flesh, as if it weren't her own face that was cut, and as if it weren't her own face that were bleeding. So you have a really great way of situating us in her psychic space, but somehow outside of the body.
And I feel like in her psychic space too, maybe there's this sense, for whatever reason, of her like seeing all these things for the first time.
Right.
Which is kind of a strange feeling to have, but I think you kind of get from some of the sentences.
But isn't that also part of the logic of celebrity, or of being like a very publicly visible figure, right? Like looking at your own face and not knowing.
Totally, and I feel like that's what happens with her in the mirror, especially at that one point in the mirror where she tries to wipe off. She tries to wipe off the things she thinks, she's not sure if it's on her face. I mean, we've all done this, or it's like something on the mirror.
Right.
And that's a really important moment that kind of just glides by within the book.
Yeah, there's my favorite part of, sorry, I'll just go on a tangent for a second. My favorite part of the novel House of Mirth, of Edith Wharton's House of Mirth, is when Lily Bart keeps looking at her face in the mirror trying to figure out whether the marionette lines on the side of her mouth are just a trick of the light or whether they're getting deeper and deeper. And it's that same kind of moment of seeing your own face and not knowing how to interact with it or be
And also, I mean, to borrow the puppeteer metaphor,
yeah.
I mean, that's very much there as well. It's like, oh my God, can I puppeteer my own body to feel these things?
Right.
Can I, what am I seeing? Is it real? Is it not real? You know, like, that means someone's pulling the strings somewhere.
Right.
Who is that person?
Right. Well, who is that person in this book? Because we have these two sort of absent parents, but who in their absence are all the more present,
Yes.
right? Are all the more present. Their disappointments are more present. Their negligence is more present. Are they the kind of puppeteers here, or?
No, I mean, I would immediately jump to talk about Josephine maybe in this context, as if we literally wanted to talk about who's looming. That's the grandmother character who's kind of like this matriarchal, this controlling matriarch who was, you know, who married a big, you know, jazz musician, was like, you know, the backup dancer who marries the big musician, who then takes it upon herself to make it the family, you know, famous, so to speak, or, and she's in a way behind the scenes, even in a very literal surveilling way, which you'll see later in the book, which is another topic. But I think more than anything, it's kind of like a lack, if one can say that. The whole book is about, I guess, inversion and lacks, but it's a lack that's driving this book. All these lacks,
Right.
you know, all these missing pieces, all these missing people, the missing of care except for from Lucy, like all these lacks, these like holes that are in the story and in the language too, maybe.
Well, I think maybe what's disturbing about the book is to have an entire cast of characters in which not a single one can reliably be turned to for anything that resembles understanding or sympathy. And there's something very bleak about the world that you have offered us.
I mean, completely. And I think I also did that on purpose as a way of sort of, in maybe, and I don't know if allegorical, you have to tell me if this is the right word, but in an allegorical way of just highlighting the problems in the culture industry, in the politics of the world in which we live, showing that all these people exist and their interest in individualism, not in the individualism of like nursery school, like be unique, but in the individualism of capitalism, or I mean, not to like go there exactly, but you know, or the individualism of be out for yourself, to do the best thing you can for yourself, and don't think about what's going on around you.
I was thinking about in the section that you read, that moment where you talk about how, you know, some children, you know, I never understood why children were afraid of shots, and I was just thinking about how I just took my kids to get vaccines, and my older one started screaming like 2 hours before we got there. And so there was this, it wasn't even about the pain in the moment, it was about the anticipation of pain. And so I'm interested in what happens when you're someone who not only can't feel pain, but can't anticipate pain. How does that change Margot's sense of time, her relationship to the future, the way that she makes decisions when there isn't even the possibility of feeling physical pain?
I think that's huge, and I think that comes back to the thing that, you know, people refer to a lot about the book too, of her choosing to be in dynamics with people who can't meet her needs. Because how can you know what your needs are if you can't anticipate something causing pain?
Right.
Or like, where does intentionality come in when you're not sure that your receptors are seeing what's really happening? And all these kind of questions yeah, I mean, think about it, if you feel pain as a human being, your goal is to get through the day without activating any of it, meaning without hurting yourself, right? So what does it mean to have the exact opposite be your guide?
Right. Well, what you're saying, just to couple that with what you said about individualism, also makes me think, like, what does it mean to create a narrator, a protagonist, who has no understanding of her own needs, no anticipation of how she may or may not feel hurt, no ability to ground herself in her relationships with other people? I mean, this seems to me to be the critique of the individualism that we tend to get in the novel.
Yeah.
That you have given us a narrator who's totally stripped of everything that normally anchors characters to the world around them.
That, yes, and also, I mean, I think that also creates some of the sensations that we've been talking about, but I think also, one of the more also important in that context is the fact that she's also kind of stripped of agency.
Yeah.
And it's kind of crazy to write a character. I'm writing the character who's stripped of agency. Like, does that even make sense, right? To be putting down something.
Yeah.
Because I have to have the agency to create the character, but it was all these kind of like rabbit holes of.
Yeah, well, you say something, you have a really nice line in there about how women, and I can't remember if your narrator, if Margot is discussing the cinema or if she's discussing music, where she talks about how women are often created through negation, through what they are not, or and then a little bit later she thinks too much negation leads to annihilation. Leads to annihilation. And so we have a novel that, without I think giving the ending away, tends to neither redemption nor exactly to annihilation. It just kind of continues with negation, right? How did you think about the arc of a novel like this?
Yeah, it's funny because I guess some people dislike that, and that's become a talking point, not to get too much into it, about, you know, how abrupt it is, about where it falls in terms of like spacing, you know, there's nothing. It's funny because actually the super rationals I meant to write as kind of a palindrome plot, which I just thought of now, which is the exact opposite of this.
Yeah,
which,
yeah,
you know, it's funny, I had never thought of that before, just in the way that it would like fold into itself, and whereas this is like completely chopped up in a different way, so that there's no, you know, folding over.
Was it Tao Lin who wrote that he
Yeah.
had a problem with the last three sentences of
Yes.
it? Was that, yeah, the last three sentences?
Yes, and then had to read, and someone else said the same thing to me about, you know, and then they had to go back and read the book, and what also has been interesting is that the reactions to those last sentences have been different among different people. I mean, I know I don't want to get into the giving away, but like different people think different things happened, which is quite magical in its own. I mean, I never anticipated that happening, but in its own way. But yeah, I think the ending for me, there is no redemption. There's no better world than the world she's in, which is a commentary on our world, the world we're in. But there is a taking back of something.
Well, that taking back of something happens after, you know, she's in Bozeman, Montana. She meets a man in a cemetery, always a good place to go pick up men in a cemetery. And she never learns his name. She saves him in her phone as Graves, which I thought was quite funny. And it turns out that he is a doctor who works on precisely the disorder that she has. Can you just talk a little bit about, you know, after spending the first half or 60% of the novel setting up this sort of family relationship, why Graves comes in? Whose name sort of portends death. why he comes into it. What is the romance plot or the faux romance plot doing for you there?
Well, a couple of things about that, just to note that him naming him Graves also was interesting to me with this idea of how we put everyone in our phone, like as, you know, that was like the most obvious example. But I have friends who put people in their phone as so and so with blue eyes, or like, you know 12 Sarahs. So this is like Sarah with the tiger emoji, and this she just like, okay, I'm gonna put him on my phone as Graves, which is also French for serious.
Right.
So that's like another one of, you know, kind of thing that I was interested in, and the idea, it's funny when you say it like that, it makes it super clear. In any sort of abusive dynamic, think about this, the person who's grooming someone figures out exactly what it is that the other person wants. Imagine in this case, he, for some reason, his specialty is the exact disorder that she has. I mean, just as a side note, it's something to think about. And, you know, is that real? Is it not real? There's a lot of that throughout the book. But the romantic dynamic between them was especially important because it became a way for her to sort of, first of all, find a name for her disorder. It was the first time someone had been able to tell her what her disorder was. And it was through a romantic dynamic, which became an abuse. For me, a lot of the book was about abusive emotional relationships and how I could explore them through this lack of physicality or neurological science, so to speak. If that, in the terms of intentionality, in terms of, the sickness is meant. It's also used very much in an absurdist, surrealist way. Whereas, like, people have asked me, did you research it very much? And the answer is no, because that wasn't about that so much. And whereas there are some great writers I can think of who would have made an amazing book where they had researched the technicalities of this disease, and for me it was more of a vehicle in an absurdist way, in a surrealist way, to get to the heart of the fact of, what happens in a relationship in which that there's something going on that doesn't feel quite right, even if you can't feel, so to speak.
Right. Well, it brings me back to the very last sentence of the section that you read where she is looking at the cows.
She loves cows.
She loves cows, yeah. She can join the sort of pantheon of novelists who have written about cows, including, Lydia Davis,
Totally.
One of my favorites. But the novel actually begins with an epigraph from Reddit. And that epigraph is, "Cows are not sentient beings." And of course the question that your novel, I think, prompts us all to ask is, well, how do you know? Is it because they cannot express pain that we believe that they are not sentient beings? So, there's a very sort of human body horror
100%.
to the novel that you've written, but I think that makes us, it expands and makes us think a little bit about what else in our world, what soft-bodied soap things might actually be sentient or have feeling or the capacity to experience either pain or pleasure that we just don't know about, right?
Totally, and I was thinking a lot, and it's come up a couple of times of, sociopathy or, things like that in which, and being neurodivergent in different ways and how that looks and feels and how that informs our relationships, that there, what it means to be normal is not even, worth even discussing in some ways. Like, what is that to be normal, and so I was thinking a lot about that, and I think the idea, it's funny because the idea of an object always comes up throughout my work, and you've just you've just given me so much great insight into things that I wasn't necessarily even thinking about, but the book is about, in a way too, the life or the possible life of some of these objects, right?
Yeah.
That are and it's almost a joke, right? Like a rock can't feel, but that would be part of this book if we were to discuss, can a rock, this book, Margot probably had pet rocks, let's be honest, that's seems like the kind of thing that, and what does that even mean? And then, in terms of her, it's funny with the cows too, because someone said something to me about, was it a commentary on dairy farming? Which is because also, she uses the word ressasser in terms of the Chantal Ackerman quote, and they're it could also mean a cow chewing the cud, and I'm like, whoa, this was, it's gone in all directions, but for sure, it's a lot about, and what even is sentience? Speaking of the woman who does, AI, what is AI psychoanalysis? You know what I mean?
Well, I was going to ask you that when you first, I was going to say, what on earth is AI psychoanalysis?
Yeah, exactly. But she wanted to talk about hysteria, so I just, But maybe her saying that, she does, I know her, so this isn't true, but I would make the joke, maybe that's kind of like Graves saying he's a trauma surgeon.
Right.
AI psychoanalysis.
Right.
Okay.
Right. What are you working on now? What's the next novel, the next book?
So I've been keeping together a bunch of different sorts of seeds of things. I did a short story that came out in Heavy Traffic magazine. That was my first sort of very short story, and it was a complete pivot from the normal kind of thing that I do. It was called Semi-Automatic, and it was about a self-driving car and the mother of a school shooter and her self-driving car. So it was a whole nother thing. But
AI psychoanalysis.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess, the self-driving car is, again, to the idea of the inanimate, sentient, anyway. But
I don't have a driver's license, so I'm very pro.
I lost mine, so don't ask.
I'm very pro self-driving cars, yeah.
I let mine lapse, and I shouldn't be allowed to drive anyway, as people tell me. The next thing I really want to tackle, to be honest with you, and it's quite a large thing to say, but I'm interested in telling you this, is I really think I need to tackle a character who is a mother and motherhood and children in a way unlike in this book, but in a much more direct way, because it seems to me, if I think of the books in kind of some kind of trilogy or some, exploring certain, like that to me feels like the most urgent thing for me now to start to look into with my characters.
What feels urgent about that?
I just think, I look at the Super Rationals was very much a satire of the art world, and again, similar themes, there's like feminist Marxists look at, the muse-artist relationship, and then, you get this book where it's a lot about, again, body horror and, these kind of like politics embedded underneath that in the story, and in none of the stories, and again, it's where I am in my life, I just feel like there's some big, there's a hole in terms of discussing the relationship of mother to child, father to child, or, in general, especially considering this book is about the most narcissistic, version of that.
Right. I think, I haven't been keeping track of time, but I am going to turn to the audience for questions now. If anybody has, yes, what's your name?
Elizabeth.
Hello. Have we met?
Oh, no.
Very familiar. Anyway, hello, Elizabeth. Yes,
Hello.
go ahead.
Okay. From what I understand and know, you have an incredible work ethic. And I think that is the most exciting thing to me in someone is when they are just a prolific writer. You write and you write and you write. And I'm not sure the timeline of when you wrote this, and you were, you're a little bit elusive, but I know some of your background, how you wrote this given your circumstances. Was it during the pandemic? Anything about your process. I would love to know.
That's so nice, and I am a bit of an extremist, I guess, in most things in my life, and certainly in my work. And it's been a bit difficult because since having two children, I no longer have, for the time that was always my best writing time was right when I woke up, and I would often wake up at like 4:30 or 5 a.m. and that was when I was at my best, and that's been, that's no longer really possible. I thought, oh yeah, I can make this work, but no, you can't make that work. And if you think you can, it's not happening. Do you know what I mean? So that went out of the window really quick, and I had to kind of readjust. And so for me, it became this thing where the actual writing, I can only compare it maybe to when I've heard people discuss how different people paint, but the actual writing happens very fast. Like the putting down of the words happens very fast. And at first I was worried that was like a terrible sign. Like I was worried that, and then, you know what, this is so silly, but what made me feel better, someone told me Remains of the Day was written in 2 weeks. And did you heard this?
No, I haven't.
And then I looked it up, and it was true, and I was so, okay, so maybe, you can't because you worry that if you're writing something so fast, it can't possibly, but you feel it. It wasn't written in 2 weeks, mind you, but I'm just saying as an example, that something could be done in this way, just like you could, be just thinking about a painting for, months, and then when you actually do the mark making, it's a very quick period. And I guess in a way I write like that, also because it's musical, because it's a feeling and intuition, and the ideas are so much wrapped up in the emotionality. And when I'm reading, I'm always watching, I'm always writing, and I kind of do this thing where I distill notes, where I'll write notes and then I'll write the same thing, and then I have notebooks and they just get smaller and smaller and tighter until they become the thing. Does that make sense?
And how long did it take?
This book actually was written very fast, but the idea, I had found the original clipping in 2010, so, the ideas were there, and, the scene, actually, the first scene that I wrote was the cow fence scene, which is kind of interesting, and that was written 2.5, 3 years ago before the pandemic, and then when it got down to actually having to turn my editor's behind you, so he can, I got it. Do you want to answer?
No, I better not.
Okay.
I was thrilled ever without you, though.
That's very sweet. I did it quite fast because I had to. I had 2 children. They were home all the time. They were, and that was a thing. And then I was also doing a lot of very emotional things in my life, and this book is an exorcism of that in a way as well, which made it feel very vital at the moment. So
it's the annoying thing about children, they're home with you.
Always there.
They live with you, yeah. They don't leave. Other questions from the audience? Come on. Yes, what's
I'm
your name?
curious.
What's your name?
Gabriel.
Gabriel, hello.
I'm curious about, so you didn't want to do specific research. What were you reading or listening to, and is it different from book to book? Who are your inspirations, or what do you find that you can't read while you're writing? Because I know for me sometimes it's like, I love that person, but I can't read that shit while I'm trying to work on something like this. So
That's a
just
great
curious
question.
about input.
That's a great question. In fact, and I'm actually interested in what you have to say about this. Very much so. So I want to maybe, I can't read fiction when I'm writing fiction, really. Do you think that's terrible?
I think writers are very precious about these sorts of things. No, I don't think it's terrible.
I think it's the reason is because I'm scared of co-opting things subconsciously, to be honest, because so much is like, even when you're reading, it's what you take in between the lines, and so I often find it difficult to read fiction when I'm writing fiction, when I'm in the actual act of writing the book, which I know is probably shouldn't be the case. So I would, while I'm writing, I'm probably researching. Like I read a lot about punk music. I read a lot about, the Council at Cannes Film Festival, because those were two other strands within the narrative that I needed to learn about. I was watching the actual movies that didn't show, once again, the inversion, the blankness, during the Cannes Film Festival, which became part of the narrative as well.
Were you listening to the Beastie Boys and Kate Bush? Like central roles.
Yes,
in
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. The backpack music, and Bjork, and thinking about CDs a lot, and thinking about, remember the CD player and how there were the round CD players that would get, I was thinking about all these things, and
Can I interrupt for a second? Doesn't that kind of link back to what we were talking about coolness, though? That this is a novel in which there are these very, I love your question, because I think this is a novel in which there are these very kind of rarefied cultural
very
artifacts,
true.
right? The '68 Cannes Film Festival, Bjork, who is sort of explicitly positioned here against the Beastie Boys.
Right.
There are all of these, for lack of a better word, these artifacts of high art or a particular kind of avant-garde art that circulate through this novel that give it that aura, right?
Well, it's a really good point, and for me, I think that was also kind of a joke in a way, and I think I do stuff like that as a joke, whereas it's like super easy to see a lot of what I do on the surface, but it was actually to kind of like poke fun at pretension rather than to be pretentious, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. I don't think, that seems clear to me from the...
Yeah, and I think that it was just funny to me that, all these people who are always like, oh, like these references, or like this list of things, or I know this person, or, all this stuff I just always find so funny. So throughout the book, it was kind of an effort also to work them in, but show kind of the absurdity also of the culture industry, and of claiming these things that somehow give us status to know about them.
But also the absurdity of the poor little rich girl plot, right? Which you mobilize here almost as a dare, right? Let me give you the most kind of cliched poor little rich girl plot. She goes to Brown.
Yeah, and
she gets kicked out for doing drugs, right? Moves to New York, stays at her grandmother's apartment, right. So that's also part of that handbag, that Birkin bag of cliches that we're getting in the.
Oh yeah, the book is. Throughout the book, there's tons of things like that, and also like these, like even the jazz jokes, right? Like the cat's name is Miles Davis. Like making a jazz joke is its own kind of pretension, right? And like being aware of it is its own kind of pretension, and so in that way, it's like you cannot take the book self-seriously.
Right.
And I think that's an important distinction, because it's also very dark, the humor.
Right.
And that plays into that as well.
Right. Other questions? Yes.
I'm fascinated by the title, primarily because there's been sort of a lot of talk about this moment that I guess maybe a little life is the best representative of sort of trauma porn in literature. And what happens when you now have a character protagonist who herself doesn't feel pain. And so again, without having read the book, just sort of inviting you to maybe sort of comment about this tendency in which we're usually invited to read books with trauma and sort of this and now you have a requirement, it doesn't actually offer you much of that.
And that's also another inversion, I don't know if the word's inversion or, playful cliche thing about the book, right? Is that everyone was talking about this trauma plot, and my whole point about this book is there's no trauma plot.
Right. Right. Well,
In the sense,
yeah.
oh, go ahead, go.
No, you go. No, it's your book. You answer.
No,
And
I
then I'll
want-
give my like literary.
your take.
critic.
I want yours.
Well, I was just gonna, I think you're right, and I think that that's what's really interesting about the book. And more generally, I would say that, we have, Freud gives us a very sophisticated theory of trauma that is not premised on something traumatic happening to you, but rather on the trauma of being a human being in the world, right? And that's what I take Stephanie's novel to be interested in, on the trauma of being born to parents, right? On the trauma of the loneliness that results when you have to individuate from them. It's not necessarily about like cutting yourself or being in an accident or overdosing on drugs or your friend killing themselves or your mother killing themselves or whatever, right? It's about the sort of primary trauma of being a human being in the world. And that's the kind of trauma we don't talk about enough. And I think as a result of that, and as a result of the sort of disappearance of psychoanalysis from the scene, now everything is trauma and everything is violence, because we've lost that kind of sophisticated framework for understanding what a kind of humanist
And
primal trauma is.
And even for that, I would use the term collective trauma.
Yeah.
To apply to what the book's about in that way, and that furthers the underlying politics of that. That it's about, it's not about, it's one woman's psychic space, but really we don't even get to really know her, right?
Right.
So she's presenting to us a collective trauma, or a collective something if you zoom out from the book in this kind of,
Right.
absurdist way.
Right. Or that the loneliness she feels, the isolation she feels, the inability to communicate, the feeling that one must always be sort of degrading one's feelings in those attempts to communicate, right? Those are all, universal or collective or what have you. They're not reliant really on her class position, on her privilege, on any of the specific things that happen to her. Yeah.
No, not at all. And I think that, a focus on that also leads to the importance of saying that it's a critique and not an endorsement of a lot of those things because of what happens to her. Because, this is someone who has had all of these privileges, and the point is they are completely unable to feel.
Right.
So it's it couldn't be even a larger kind of joke than that, really.
Right. I think we have time maybe for one final question, although that was so beautifully said, Stephanie, I almost want to end on that. But if anyone has a final question, so that we can end on an even more eloquent answer from Stephanie, please be brave. Is that a hand?
It is a hand, but it's not a question.
It's not, okay, all right. Well then I will, yes, go ahead. What's your name?
My name is Aikuna.
Hi.
I was very struck by your psychoanalysis of AI comment. I'm kind of wondering, who do I know who works on this? Isabel Millar?
Yeah, that's who I was talking about, yeah.
And she makes a point in her book that, well, when is something a sentient being, right? And for her is it enjoying? Is it able to enjoy? If it's not able to enjoy pleasure, right, jouissance, then, it's not a sentient being. And so I was thinking also in relation to the title and how far the alienation of your character has gone to, have taken a step back because, pain connects, right? Pain in the history of human beings have been a very connecting kind of glue, right? Communities grow through pain. They see each other through pain. And then she's saying, well, I fear my pain interests you. Also assumes that, well, you're not interested in my pain, but look at me, you should listen, or you should pay attention to this. So just comment.
No, I think that's good. I think the title itself is problematic in a good way, because it's saying, I fear my pain interests you, and of course, the whole thing is she has no pain, right? So what we're interested by throughout the whole book is the opposite of that. And then there's also, you know, the idea that it's a bad translation, and that always interests me, these translation jokes. And I mean, there's just a lot there. And I like the comment that you made about, you know, about joy and pleasure, because there was also the, you know, in the book, it's like if you have this disorder, a lot of times people can't orgasm, and you know, that could have been taken further in the narrative as well as to what that means, which I didn't really go so much into that. But there was some mention of, you know, a sharing of pleasure or intentionality in sex, and how does that mean in terms of connection and all that kind of thing.
I mean, what you said just makes me think about how people in the novel are interested in the absence of pain in her, right? The Graves, for instance.
Yes.
Creating his whole narrative to be interested in the absence of pain in her, but not being interested in the sort of psychic pain.
Yes,
So part of the question might be, like, what kinds of pain do we want other people to take an interest in? And how can we communicate that pain such that, as you said, Stephanie, it does become collective rather than purely individual?
And I mean, also, I don't know if this is going too far, you know, to the other side, but there's, you know, talk of Juliet or the Marquis de Sade, and like we can go in that way, and you know, and sort of, I mean, sadism versus masochism, and you know how that operates as well. And I think that in terms of, also for me, it was also about a celebrity statement. The I fear my pain interests you was also about celebrity.
Right.
It was like why do we read these trashy tabloid magazines?
Right.
You know.
Right. Why are we interested in the pain of people we don't even know?
And why they got a divorce, or who they're like, why do we care about that?
Yeah. Well, I fear my pain interests you will interest you. So get in there. And you will have to buy one of the signed copies by the brilliant Stephanie LaCava. Thank you so much.
No, we're right on time.
Oh,
Please, one warm round of applause. Please buy a book, make sure to talk to the authors. They'll be lingering here, and our store closes at 9 p.m., so you guys have some time to mingle and chat. And please come to more Greenlight events. We have a lot of good stuff coming up. Thank you.
Thank you.